My name is Emily, and this story begins with the kind of shock that makes your breath catch in your throat. I still remember the exact moment the wedding planner's voice turned brittle on the phone. She said your husband contacted us yesterday. He canceled your invitation to his brother's wedding. My mind spun. Did I hear her right before I could respond? She added. But he also insisted that the $40,000 you deposited for the venue, catering, and hotel must remain in place. It was like the ground shifted under my feet. Not only was I erased from the guest list, but the money I had quietly provided was being consumed without hesitation. A family celebration I had personally funded was now transformed into a gathering where my existence was deliberately erased. I forced my voice to remain steady. Years of business negotiations had trained me to control my tone even when fury boiled beneath my skin. "Cancel the entire wedding," I said flatly. The planner gasped. "But ma'am, you are not the bride." She was right. I wasn't the bride. I wasn't even considered worthy of being a guest anymore. But what she didn't realize was that every detail of this wedding venue, food, and lodging was tied back to me. I wasn't just a guest. I was the foundation. As I sat in my office overlooking the Phoenix skyline, my grip tightened around the phone. Scott, my husband of 15 years, had made a calculated move. He had decided my presence was inconvenient, but my money was essential. That was not a mistake. It was a strategy. And that strategy revealed how he truly viewed me not as a partner, but as a resource to be controlled and drained. I thought back to the family dinner only weeks earlier. His brother Frank had announced his engagement with joy shadowed by worry. Their family discussed budgets $5,000 if they sacrificed everything, folding chairs instead of proper seating, a dress from a discount rack, a reception at a community center. I had listened in silence as they circled around the impossible dream. Scott kept glancing at me as though expecting me to offer a little help. He had no idea I could easily cover the entire event with less than 2 days of my company's revenue. And when Frank's fiancée cried, I quietly wrote a check for $40,000. I asked only for anonymity. I wanted them to enjoy their day without feeling indebted. That night I believed I had given a gift of love. I never expected it would be weaponized against me. Now, on the phone, the planner explained how my name had been scrubbed from seating charts and announcements. My stomach turned cold. This wasn't just exclusion. It was humiliation. Scott had told vendors I was unstable, that I had agreed to step back, that this was for family harmony. He lied. He stole my money. And he erased me with a single phone call. For the first time in years, I let myself sit in silence and truly absorb the weight of what had happened. 15 years of building a marriage, of pouring energy into a family that never acknowledged my worth, had collapsed into a single brutal reality. They saw me as valuable only for what I provided, never for who I was. Outside, the city pulsed with life cars moving like veins of light beneath my office window. But inside, my world was narrowing into clarity. I realized something I had ignored for far too long. Power whispers, insecurity shouts. And I had been whispering while others shouted over me. That moment, I made a decision. If they wanted to erase me, they would learn what happens when you cross out the person holding the pen. The morning after that devastating phone call, I stood in my corner office, staring out at the city skyline. Phoenix glittered under the rising sun, but for me, the world had never felt darker. My husband had erased me from his brother's wedding, yet demanded my $40,000 remain untouched. Most people would have broken down. But I am not most people. My name is Emily. For 15 years, my husband's family labeled me the wife who helped with parties. They never saw me as more than a side character. What they did not realize was that I had built Morrison Hospitality into a southwestern empire spanning 4 states. Hotels, resorts, catering, companies, luxury venues. My quarterly reports were thicker than legal textbooks, filled with profits that would make Fortune 500 executives envious. Yet to Scott, I was still his little event helper. That illusion ended the moment I realized he thought he could erase me while keeping my money. I leaned back in my leather chair, fingers tapping against mahogany. My assistant had already placed today's schedule on my desk: 3 acquisition meetings, 1 board review, and a call with investors in Nevada. These people respected me. They knew my signature could expand markets or crush competitors. And yet, in my own marriage, I was treated like a disposable checkbook. The wedding planner's words echoed in my head. We have never encountered a situation where the primary financial contributor was excluded, but their funds required. Her voice carried professional concern, even sympathy. Strangers in business recognized the injustice more clearly than my husband of 15 years. I thought back to that dinner where it all began. Frank and Sarah, worried about loans and mortgages, couldn't imagine affording their dream wedding. The family had wrung their hands, tossing around ideas that sounded more like survival tactics than celebration plans. A courthouse ceremony, folding chairs at a community hall, a dress from a clearance rack. And Scott, my husband, he had glanced at me repeatedly with that silent expectation, as though I might step in with a coupon or a contact, maybe shave a few dollars off. He had no idea that in my world $40,000 was less than I spent decorating my living room. I could give them everything they wanted without blinking, and I did. I wrote the check that same evening, slipping it quietly to Teresa, my sister-in-law, who cried with gratitude. I asked only one thing: anonymity. Because I believed true generosity didn't need a spotlight. How naive I had been. That gift became my downfall. By keeping it a secret, I gave Scott the perfect weapon. He could claim my money as his contribution. He could erase my presence while maintaining the benefits. He turned my generosity into ammunition for betrayal. I poured coffee from my Waterford Crystal Service, a gift to myself, after acquiring my 10th venue, and watched the steam curl into the air. It struck me with bitter irony. My competitors, investors, even rivals respected me. Yet, in the one place where loyalty should have been sacred, my marriage, I was nothing but a resource to exploit. But here's the truth: when people underestimate you, they hand you the sharpest blade. They expose their arrogance. And arrogance is always blind to consequence. I set my cup down and picked up the phone. My voice carried the same authority that had closed hostile takeovers. "Thank you for informing me," I told the planner. "This matter will be handled directly." She hesitated. "Mrs. Morrison, may I just say, we are uncomfortable proceeding without your explicit consent." Her words gave me a spark of grim satisfaction. Even outsiders knew this was wrong. That was when it crystallized in me: I would not be erased. Not this time. Before I tell you what happened next, let me pause. Stories like this about finding your voice when others try to silence you deserve to be heard. If you believe quiet strength deserves recognition, take a moment to subscribe. It is free, and it helps us reach more women who need to hear that their worth is not up for negotiation. Now back to the story. I hung up the phone and looked again at the empire I had built, the art on the walls, the contracts stacked on my desk, the skyline glowing outside my window. This was mine. Every piece of it, built from nothing but grit and vision. And now, for the first time, I was ready to wield it. Scott thought he could erase me quietly. But I was about to remind them all, that you cannot erase the woman who owns the ink. I wish I could say that betrayal felt new to me, but the truth is, it had been quietly growing in the background of my life for years. The wedding was only the spark that lit a fire already soaked in gasoline. From the outside, my marriage looked perfect. A husband, a house in a wealthy neighborhood, family dinners filled with laughter. But underneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of dismissal, of subtle minimization that chipped away at me like waves eroding stone. For 15 years, I had been cast into a role. At gatherings, Scott introduced me as my wife who helps with events. Never as the founder of Morrison Hospitality. Never as the strategist who turned bankrupt properties into jewels of the desert. His words weren't careless. They were calculated. They kept me small in the eyes of his family. To them, I was the helper, not the leader. I remember one Thanksgiving particularly well. Frank talked at length about his architectural projects. Sarah complained about student loans. Scott's parents praised his sister for her new teaching job. When the spotlight briefly turned toward me, Scott quickly shifted it away. Emily's been busy with her little catering thing, he said. A ripple of polite smiles moved around the table. Nobody asked questions. Nobody cared. I went home that night and signed papers for a $10 million acquisition. But I signed them alone. Looking back now, I see it clearly. They liked me best when I was invisible, and I let it happen. That is the hardest truth to admit. I stayed quiet. I thought keeping peace was better than speaking up. I believed that love meant sacrifice, that family harmony required swallowing pride. But with every year that passed, silence became my prison. When I gave Frank and Sarah $40,000 for their wedding, I told myself I was doing it out of love. But deep down, I think I hoped it would earn me something else. Respect, gratitude, maybe even belonging. Instead, it bought me exclusion. Now, in the quiet of my office, I realize that this pattern had always been there. Scott never celebrated my wins. His family never acknowledged my role. They enjoyed the benefits of my work, the vacations, the dinners, the comfortable lifestyle, but they denied me dignity. I set down the crystal coffee cup and pressed my fingers against my temples. For the first time in years, I let myself feel it. The loneliness, the weight of invisibility. The realization that I had been building bridges to people who never intended to meet me halfway. That clarity came with pain, but also with freedom. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And here is something I want to ask you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever sacrificed, given, poured yourself out only to be dismissed, minimized, or erased? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your stories, because sharing them matters. Back then, I still wanted to believe Scott's betrayal was a mistake. I wanted to think maybe there had been a misunderstanding, that somehow love could still be salvaged. But deep down, I knew better. When someone shows you what you mean to them, believe them. Scott had shown me. I was not his partner. I was his resource. The thought stung, but it also awakened something fierce inside me. I had been silent too long. If they wanted me invisible, I was about to show them what happens when invisible people decide to be seen. The city outside moved on as if nothing had happened. Cars hummed below. Business deals unfolded in skyscrapers around me. But inside that office, my life had shifted forever. I was done whispering. I was ready to speak, and more than that, I was ready to act. The woman they thought was powerless was about to show them the kind of power they could never comprehend. The first cracks in Scott's plan revealed themselves in whispers, not shouts. Vendors began calling my office confused about contradictory instructions. The wedding planner hesitated, her voice careful, as she explained that my name had been scrubbed from seating charts. The caterer reached out, uneasy, about sudden menu changes made without consulting the person who paid. And then, the hotel manager called, baffled by requests to adjust accommodations, while keeping my account on file for charges. Every conversation carried the same theme. Scott had moved swiftly to erase me while protecting access to my $40,000. It was not clumsy, it was methodical. He wanted the benefits of my resources without my presence, and he was arrogant enough to believe I would never fight back. That arrogance burned hotter in memory when I reread his text. Stop being dramatic. You are not coming to Frank's wedding. The money stays. We will talk when you calm down. My pulse had raced when I first saw those words. The casual cruelty, the dismissal of my outrage as nothing more than hysteria. 15 years of marriage reduced to a sentence that painted me as unreasonable for demanding dignity. Scott's family fell right in line. His sister Teresa called, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She said, "Emily, we thought you were overwhelmed with work. We wanted you to relax. That is why we kept you off the list." Relax. They had stolen my seat at the table, then dressed it up as a gift. His mother left a voicemail filled with platitudes about focusing on Frank's happiness and letting bygones be bygones. Translation: stay quiet, keep paying, and accept being erased. But the most painful silence came from Frank himself, the man whose wedding I had funded completely. Days passed without so much as a text. He let his fiancée and family do the talking while he hid in the shadows. That silence revealed his choice. Gratitude was not stronger than loyalty to Scott's narrative. I could feel the betrayal pressing in from every direction, tightening like a vice around my chest. Yet within that pressure, something new was forged. Clarity. The clarity that family dynamics are sometimes just polished excuses for exploitation. It reminded me of the night I handed Teresa the check. She had cried, clutched my hands, and whispered, "You are saving us." Scott had been in the next room watching television, oblivious. At the time, her gratitude felt genuine. Now I realized it had simply given Scott the perfect cover story. He could tell the vendors I agreed. He could tell his family I had stepped aside. He could paint me as unstable while cashing in my generosity. That was the real cruelty. My desire to stay anonymous to give without recognition became the weapon they used to cut me out. Standing at the window of my office, the Phoenix skyline blazing gold in the afternoon sun, I made myself a promise. They had taken my silence for weakness. They mistook humility for absence of power. That was their mistake. And mistakes always have consequences. Because here is the truth, family betrayal cuts deepest when it is systematic. But it also fuels the sharpest kind of resolve. Scott's family wanted me erased, but their entire plan rested on one assumption, that I would remain quiet. They had no idea the storm that was coming. The night after Teresa's call, I sat in my office long past midnight. My desk was covered with contracts, quarterly reports, and old acquisition files. I wasn't just reviewing paperwork. I was studying my own history, reminding myself of who I really was. The woman Scott dismissed as emotional had built an empire with steady hands and relentless discipline, and that empire was about to become my shield and my sword. Scott thought he was clever. He believed the family could spin a story that I was too unstable for the wedding, that I had agreed to step back. He assumed the vendors would fall in line with whatever he told them. But there was one detail he never understood. Those vendors did not work for him. They worked for me. 3 years earlier, I had acquired Southwest Event Solutions during their bankruptcy, quietly, without fanfare. That purchase made me the parent company of Desert Rose Wedding Planning, Sunset Ridge Estate. The picturesque venue Frank and Sarah had chosen was managed under one of my holding companies. Copper Canyon Catering folded into Morrison Hospitality after a strategic buyout, and Desert Palm Resort, the crown jewel of the wedding weekend. Every guest room, every ballroom belonged entirely to me. Every thread of their dream day was woven into my empire, and Scott had just pulled the one string that connected them all, me. When I realized the scope of my ownership, I laughed, a bitter, sharp sound that echoed off the glass walls of my office. They thought they had erased me, when in reality I owned every single piece of the celebration. The family who saw me as invisible had unknowingly built their entire fantasy wedding on the foundation of my empire. The irony was perfect, the cruelty was poetic, and the opportunity was undeniable. I picked up the phone the next morning and called Diane, the planner. My tone was cold, precise, the voice that had closed deals no one thought possible. "Diane, I am the ultimate stakeholder here. Any instructions Scott gave you are invalid. Effective immediately, cancel every contract related to the Henderson Walsh wedding. Inform all vendors their services are no longer required." Silence followed. I could hear her shuffle papers, her breath catch. Finally, she stammered, "Mrs. Morrison, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," I replied. "My husband has no authority in this business. And now he will learn what happens when you misrepresent power you do not have." That day, phone calls rippled across the industry, contracts dissolved, reservations vanished from the system, deposits were withdrawn. In less than 6 hours, Frank and Sarah's dream wedding disintegrated into thin air. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was clarity. It was business. They had made a choice to erase me. I was showing them what life looked like without me. That evening, my phone buzzed with Scott's name. His voice, sharp with panic, spilled through the line. "Emily, what have you done?" Frank is furious. "Teresa hasn't stopped crying. Fix this mess." I let him rant, his words dripping with entitlement. Then I spoke slowly, deliberately. "This isn't my mess, Scott. This is the natural consequence of betrayal. He shouted something about me being dramatic about ruining his brother's big day. But beneath his anger, I heard something else for the first time: fear. And that fear gave me strength. Before we move forward, I want to pause here, because this is the part of the story where many of you will recognize yourselves. Maybe you've been told you are dramatic when you are simply standing up for yourself. Maybe someone has tried to silence you while benefiting from everything you provide. If you know that pain, subscribe to this channel right now. Join a community where your strength is not dismissed, it is celebrated. As I set down the phone that night, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore. This was about rewriting the story of my own life. For 15 years I had been quiet, but silence was over. And what came next would shake every single person who underestimated me. The calls began pouring in the very next morning. Not from vendors this time, but from Scott's family. Each voice carried the same rehearsed tone, like lines from a script written in secrecy around their dinner table. His mother Margaret was the first. Her voice, smooth and practiced, floated through my voicemail. "Emily, darling, family situations can be complicated. Let's not dwell on misunderstandings. What matters is Frank's happiness. Misunderstandings." That word twisted like a knife. They had erased me, stolen my money, and called it a misunderstanding. Next came his sister Jennifer. She spoke with a syrupy kindness that barely masked her condescension. "Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. Big weddings are stressful and you have so much on your plate already. Think of this as a gift time to relax." A gift being excluded from a celebration I had entirely paid for was now a blessing. Then came the most insulting call of all, Sarah, the bride-to-be. Her voice carried the sweetness of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Emily, I just want to thank you for being so understanding. Frank and I feel so lucky to have family members like you who care more about our happiness than your own recognition." Recognition. The word burned. She was thanking me for a sacrifice I had never agreed to, twisting my forced absence into evidence of my noble character. Her performance was flawless, but the subtext was clear. My money was welcome, but my presence was not. Each conversation dripped with manipulation. They wanted to convince me that erasing me was for my own good, that my anger was an overreaction, that gratitude should silence me. But what they really wanted was control. They wanted to keep the $40,000 and my silence. The hardest part wasn't their words, it was Frank's silence. Days passed, and still he did not call. The man whose wedding I had saved with one anonymous check hid behind his fiancée and family. That absence hurt more than any cruel voicemail, because silence, too, is betrayal. I sat in my office contract spread before me, the skyline glowing orange in the late afternoon sun. And I felt it all: anger, grief, disbelief. But beneath those emotions, something sharper was forming. Resolve. They thought they could gaslight me into submission. They thought their combined voices could drown out my truth. But their unity only revealed how deep the conspiracy went. This was not a mistake. This was not one person's misstep. This was a family decision. And that was the moment I stopped seeing them as relatives and started seeing them as adversaries. I remembered Scott's text, "Stop being dramatic." That single line revealed everything. In his eyes, my outrage was hysteria. My boundaries were weakness. My generosity was obligation. He had underestimated me for 15 years, and now his family followed his lead. But they had all made the same fatal error. They forgot that the quiet woman at the table was the one who owned the table. I poured another cup of coffee, the bitterness matching my mood, and whispered aloud to the empty room, "You wanted me invisible. Now you will see me clearer than ever." Here's something I need to ask you, the listener. Have you ever been dismissed as too emotional when all you wanted was respect? Have you ever been thanked for sacrifices you never agreed to? Share your story in the comments. Because when we speak these truths, manipulation loses its power. That evening, as the city lights flickered on below, I felt strangely calm. Their betrayal had cut deep, but it had also given me something invaluable: permission. Permission to stop excusing their cruelty. permission to stop minimizing my own power. The next steps were no longer about attending a wedding. They were about teaching a lesson Scott and his family would never forget. And I was just getting started. The silence from Frank finally broke, but it came far too late. His call reached me after nearly a week of watching his family twist the narrative, after I had endured voicemail after voicemail filled with excuses and manipulation. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he had rehearsed his words. "Emily, I just wanted to thank you for your generosity. Your support means everything to Sarah and me, and we appreciate your understanding about the guest list situation." My grip on the phone tightened. Understanding. The man whose entire dream wedding I had funded was telling me he appreciated my understanding as though I had willingly agreed to be erased. I couldn't stay silent anymore. "Frank, I found out about my exclusion from your wedding through phone calls from vendors. Do you realize how insulting that is?" He chuckled nervously, the kind of laugh people use when they want to smooth over a crack in the floor rather than fix it. Well, the family thought it would be better to keep things small, more intimate. You know how personalities can clash. Personalities. That was their word for me now. A problem, a source of drama. Not the woman whose check had made their entire celebration possible. I swallowed the sting and asked the question that burned in my chest. "Frank, I funded your entire wedding. Does that not matter in your calculations?" There was a pause, then another chuckle, softer this time. "Emily, you offered that money as a gift. Gifts don't come with strings, right?" In that moment, the illusion shattered completely. The man I once believed to be honorable revealed himself as just another beneficiary of my silence, another voice in the chorus of minimization. He wanted my money, not my presence. He wanted my generosity, not my dignity. After that call, I sat in my office, staring at the city lights blinking below, and let the truth sink in. This wasn't just Scott's betrayal. This was collective. His mother, his sister, his brother, even the bride herself. Every one of them had participated in this scheme. They had met, discussed, and agreed that my money was welcome, while my presence was not. The realization hit like cold steel. I was never truly part of this family. I was their benefactor, their resource, their background character. And the moment I became inconvenient, they erased me. That night I didn't cry, I didn't scream. Instead, I wrote in my journal one line over and over again, "Never again," because this was no longer about a wedding. It was about reclaiming my voice, my place, my worth. And let me pause here to ask you something. Have you ever been told your presence was unwanted, while the things you provided, your effort, your money, your support, were still demanded? Have you ever been reduced to a resource while your humanity was ignored? Tell me in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone. That evening, Scott came home, his footsteps heavy with irritation rather than remorse. He slammed his briefcase on the counter and glared at me. "I hope you're satisfied with the chaos you've created. Vendors are panicking. Teresa has been crying all day. Frank is furious. This is your fault." I stared at him, stunned at the audacity. "My fault, Scott? You orchestrated my exclusion while stealing my money? This chaos belongs to you?" He sneered, his face twisted with indignation. "I was protecting Frank's special day from drama. You think funding something gives you the right to control everything? You're arrogant, Emily. Arrogant. That word was his shield. It wasn't my success he hated. It was the reminder that he contributed nothing to it. For 15 years, I had supported him, his family, their whims, their comforts. And in return, he labeled me arrogant for daring to expect respect. That was the moment I knew my marriage was no longer a partnership. It was a cage, and I was done living in it. So, by the time dawn broke the next morning, I was no longer a woman begging for recognition. I was a strategist preparing for war. My empire had been built quietly, brick by brick, acquisition by acquisition. Now it was time to wield it. I spread documents across my desk, ownership charts, corporate filings, contracts. I traced each line like a general studying a battle map. And there it was, in black and white, every vendor tied to Frank and Sarah's wedding, connected back to me. Desert Rose. Wedding planning mine through a subsidiary acquisition. Sunset Ridge Estate, the venue under one of my holding companies. Copper Canyon Catering absorbed into Morrison Hospitality after a buyout. And the Desert Palm Resort, where 60 guests had booked rooms, was the crown jewel of my hotel portfolio. Scott had erased me from the guest list, but in doing so he had overlooked the simplest fact. You cannot erase the owner. I remembered the smirk on his face when he accused me of arrogance. Arrogance, no. What he had mistaken for arrogance was competence. Power. The kind of power that had transformed bankrupt properties into thriving businesses. The kind of power that could unravel his family's precious wedding in a single afternoon. I called Diane, the wedding planner, my voice calm, steady. Every instruction Scott gave you is invalid. He holds no authority in this business. Effective, immediately cancel all contracts related to the Henderson-Walsh wedding. Her silence was deafening. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind as she realized the truth. Mrs. Morrison, I had no idea. If I'd known. I cut her off gently but firmly. Now you do. Notify every vendor. The wedding is over. Within hours, the dominoes fell. The venue was wiped from the calendar. Hotel reservations vanished from the system. Catering contracts dissolved. Deposits, once considered locked, were pulled back. The wedding that had taken months to plan evaporated in less than a day. Frank and Sarah had thought my presence was optional. Now they would discover it was essential. And here's what I want you to think about. How many times in your life have people tried to convince you that you don't matter, only to forget they were standing on ground you built? Sometimes the only way to remind them is to take the ground back. That afternoon, my phone lit up with Scott's name. His voice was a mixture of rage and panic. Emily, what have you done? Frank is furious. Teresa won't stop crying. You need to fix this right now. I let him spew his fury, then said quietly, This isn't my mess, Scott. It's yours. You tried to erase me. Now you get to live with the consequences. His response was a familiar one. You're being dramatic. Always the same tactic. Reduce me to emotions, dismiss my actions as hysteria. But this time I didn't take the bait. 'Cause I had moved past emotion. This wasn't about feelings anymore. This was about leverage. And leverage is something I owned in spades. Before I continue, let me pause. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had someone try to erase your role while depending on your effort, you understand exactly how I felt. Take a moment to subscribe. Join this space where your strength is seen, where your story matters. By evening, news of the cancellations rippled through Phoenix's hospitality network. Competitors called my office curious about the sudden shakeup. Vendors whispered about the quiet mogul who had pulled the plug on an entire wedding. What Scott thought would humiliate me was instead cementing my reputation as a force of nature. And I had only just begun. The fallout came faster than I imagined. By mid-morning the next day, my phone was vibrating nonstop with desperate calls. Teresa's number flashed first. Her voice was shrill, panicked, and trembling. Emily, something terrible has happened. Every single vendor has canceled. The venue, the caterer, the hotel rooms, all of it gone. I leaned back in my chair, the leather cool against my skin, and forced my tone to remain even. That sounds concerning, Teresa. Did they give you a reason? She sniffled. They all said something about corporate policy changes or directives from parent companies. But that doesn't make sense. We signed contracts. We paid deposits. How can they just walk away? Her bewilderment would have been amusing if it wasn't so insulting. She had no idea the woman she had helped betray was the very same person pulling the strings. As Teresa's tears spilled into the receiver, I felt something unexpected satisfaction. For years, her tears had manipulated me into generosity. But now they no longer held power. They sounded like justice served cold and precise. Within 20 minutes, Frank called. Unlike Teresa, his approach was measured, almost clinical, like the architect he was. Emily, I need to ask you something directly. Do you have any idea why every vendor would suddenly cancel on the same day? I let a pause stretch before replying. That does seem unusual. Have you considered whether someone with significant industry influence might have reasons for these actions? The silence on the other end told me he was processing connecting dots he had never considered. Finally, he asked, Are you suggesting someone is deliberately sabotaging us? I wouldn't want to speculate, I said carefully, but this kind of coordination would require someone with extensive connections across hospitality, someone with reach in multiple sectors. His sharp inhale betrayed recognition. For the first time, Frank began to realize the truth: his wedding hadn't collapsed by coincidence. It had been dismantled by design. Then Scott called. His voice roared through the line, laced with panic and entitlement. Emily, whatever game you're playing, it stops now. Frank is in full panic mode, Teresa's hysterical, and you're destroying everything. Fix this. I let his words hang in the air before answering. Scott, I'm not playing a game. I'm simply allowing natural consequences. You excluded me. You kept my money. Now you're learning what happens when you treat someone as disposable. He exploded. You're being spiteful because your feelings got hurt. This is exactly the emotional instability we were trying to avoid. That phrase, emotional instability, was the final twist of the knife. He had told vendors I was unstable to justify my exclusion. Now he was using the same lie to dismiss my retaliation. But here's what Scott never understood. Silence is not stability. Silence is submission. And I was finished submitting. Let me pause here because I want you to feel this with me. Have you ever been gaslit into believing your justified anger was instability? Have you ever been told to calm down while someone stole your voice? Stay with me because what happens next is the moment everything turns. By the end of the day, the truth spread like wildfire across the industry. Every canceled contract, every vanished reservation carried my signature somewhere in the paperwork. My empire's shadow loomed large, and the whispers began. The woman they had underestimated, the wife, who helps with events, was actually the queen on the board, and she had just made her first move. Frank and Sarah's dream wedding wasn't just crumbling, it was gone. And the family that had erased me was about to discover the real cost of betrayal. Ach. The panic in their voices grew louder with every passing hour. By the second day after the cancellations, the family's desperation had shifted from anger to pure chaos. Teresa called again, her voice ragged like someone who had been crying nonstop. Emily, it's impossible. Every venue in Phoenix is booked. Every caterer has turned us away. Even hotels in Tucson and Flagstaff won't take us. It's like the entire industry shut its doors. She was right. They had no idea why. But I knew. Years of acquisitions had given me quiet dominion over the entire regional market. Every major vendor worth having ultimately reported back to Morrison Hospitality. If they wanted an alternative, they'd have to settle for mediocrity. And mediocrity wasn't what Frank and Sarah had envisioned for their dream day. Frank's tone when he called was steadier. He tried to apply reason like he did with his architectural projects. Emily, do you think this is some kind of misunderstanding? Maybe contracts overlapped? Maybe there was a system error? He trailed off, but I could hear the disbelief in his own voice. Deep down he knew. The timing was too precise. The scope was too complete. I answered with careful neutrality. Frank coincidences rarely align this neatly. Perhaps someone with reach wanted to remind you that every choice carries weight. His silence was long, heavy. Finally he whispered, so this was deliberate. I didn't confirm, but I didn't deny either. Some truths are more powerful when left unsaid. Meanwhile, Scott raged like a cornered animal. He stormed into our kitchen one evening, slamming his fist against the counter. You've destroyed Frank's wedding? Do you understand what you've done? I looked him straight in the eye. No, Scott. You destroyed Frank's wedding the moment you decided to steal my money and erase me. I just stopped funding the illusion. He sneered, clinging to the same tired narrative. You're proving me right, unstable, emotional, dramatic. This is why we didn't want you there. That sentence sealed it. 15 years of marriage, and his final defense was rewriting betrayal as protection. But here's what he didn't grasp. This wasn't about a wedding anymore. This was about power. And when someone tries to erase you, the most powerful response is not anger, it's action. Let me ask you something here. Have you ever been in a situation where someone twisted reality so hard that they made you the villain for standing up for yourself? Did you ever wonder if you should have stayed silent instead? Tell me below in the comments. because your story matters. By that third evening, word had spread across Phoenix's hospitality circuit. Whispers in boardrooms, murmurs in networking dinners, Emily Morrison had pulled the plug on an entire family wedding. Competitors who once dismissed me as a regional player now studied me with newfound caution. Vendors who had treated me with routine politeness now recognized my name carried consequences. Scott's family scrambled to maintain appearances. Teresa begged me privately. Jennifer tried her syrupy persuasion. Even Margaret the matriarch called with that diplomatic voice she reserved for crisis. But none of it mattered anymore, because I finally saw them for what they were: not family, but opportunists. And opportunists don't change. They only adapt when consequences force them to. I poured myself a glass of wine that night and sat by the window watching the city lights glow against the desert sky. For the first time in years, I felt steady. Not because I had destroyed their plans, but because I had reclaimed myself. And soon I would show them that this was just the beginning. Monday morning arrived like the opening scene of a courtroom drama. I had summoned Scott, Frank, Sarah, Teresa, and both sets of parents to Morrison Hospitality's headquarters. Not an informal chat in a living room. Not another phone call drowned in excuses. No. This was a boardroom 32 floors above the city, with glass walls that overlooked downtown Phoenix and a conference table carved from a single piece of Arizona mesquite. The setting wasn't accidental. It was a stage, and I was the one holding the script. They entered one by one, their faces pale, their movements stiff. Scott walked in first, his posture, nervous hands trembling as he clutched his briefcase. Gone was the swaggering husband who once told me I was being dramatic. He now looked like a man who had finally realized the ground beneath him belonged to me. Frank and Sarah followed, careful expressions plastered across their faces like actors trying to perform neutrality. But Sarah's wide eyes gave her away. She knew she was stepping into a domain she couldn't control. Teresa arrived last, exhausted, her face marked by sleepless nights of frantic phone calls. Behind her trailed Scott's parents, both carrying the wary look of people about to face judgment. I didn't rise to greet them. I remained seated at the head of the table, dressed in a navy Armani suit, flanked by awards and acquisition certificates lining the walls. For years, these people had laughed off my success as a little catering thing. Today, they would see the empire they dismissed for what it really was. The silence was heavy, almost theatrical, as they sat down. Finally, I spoke. "Thank you all for coming. We have important matters to discuss regarding recent events and the implications for our family relationships." The words were deliberate, cold, formal, businesslike, because that's what this was now: business. And they were about to learn what happens when you betray the wrong stakeholder. Frank was the first to break. He stood slowly, his voice low but steady. "Emily, I want to apologize not just for myself, but for all of us. What we did was inexcusable. I should have questioned the decision. I should have defended you." His words rang with sincerity, and for a moment, I glimpsed the brother-in-law I had once trusted. But sincerity doesn't erase betrayal. Scott shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. His voice dripped with the same excuses I had heard for weeks. "Emily, you have to understand. We weren't trying to insult you. We were trying to protect Frank's special day from unnecessary drama. The intentions were good." I turned my gaze on him, sharp as glass. "Protect, by stealing my money and erasing me from the guest list. Explain to me how theft and betrayal qualify as protective measures." He faltered. His excuses stumbled out in fragments, growing weaker with each attempt. It was about family harmony, about avoiding conflict. We can fix this if everyone just moves past emotions and focuses on unity. I let his words hang in the air before delivering the blow. "The situation has already been fixed, Scott. Your brother's wedding was canceled because actions have consequences." The silence that followed was suffocating. They all stared at me, waiting for a lifeline, a chance to undo the damage. And that's when I laid out my terms. "Here's the only way Frank and Sarah's wedding will proceed. First, $75,000 payable in advance to cover all expenses. Second, formal written apologies from Scott, Teresa, and both parents acknowledging their treatment of me as unacceptable. Third, public recognition during the wedding reception of what nearly destroyed this celebration and why it was rebuilt. These terms are final and non-negotiable. Gasps rippled around the table. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Teresa paled. Scott's parents shifted uncomfortably as though the ground itself had turned hostile. But I didn't flinch, because this wasn't vengeance. This was justice. And justice, like business, comes with a price tag. The room went dead silent after I laid out my terms. $75,000 up front. Written apologies from every family member who had plotted behind my back, and public recognition of my role at the reception itself. I had turned their dream wedding into a negotiation, and for the first time they were sitting across the table from me, not as family, but as clients with no leverage. Scott was the first to react. His voice cracked as anger and desperation collided. Emily, be reasonable, $75,000. That's nearly double the original cost, and public apologies. Do you want to humiliate us? I locked eyes with him. Humiliation is what you did to me when you erased me from a wedding I paid for. This isn't about humiliation, Scott. It's about accountability. Frank leaned forward, his hands pressed flat against the polished mesquite table. His voice was steadier than his brother's. Emily, you're right. We treated you horribly. If these are the terms, then so be it. Scott whipped his head toward him. You can't be serious. We don't need to bow to this. Frank cut him off. We don't have a choice. You destroyed our wedding, Scott. She's offering us a way out. We should take it. For a moment I almost admired Frank. He had finally shown the backbone his family lacked. But admiration didn't erase betrayal. His willingness to comply wasn't redemption, it was survival. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Her voice, soft and carefully measured, broke the tension. Emily, if this is what it takes, we'll do it. Please. I just want to marry Frank. That's all I've ever wanted. Her words might have swayed me weeks ago when I still believed in her innocence. But now I knew better. She had been part of the whispers, the meetings, the family decision. Crocodile tears couldn't wash away complicity. Scott's parents sat stiffly, their silence speaking volumes. They wanted this to disappear quietly, as all family scandals were supposed to. But I wasn't giving them that out. Not anymore. 48 hours, I said, my voice slicing through the room. Decide whether you want a wedding under these conditions or no wedding at all. The clock starts now. I rose from my chair, signaling the meeting was over. My assistant opened the door, and one by one they filed out. Some with heads down, some with anger simmering in their eyes, all of them carrying the weight of consequences they never thought they'd face. For years I had been invisible at their table. Now they were leaving mine in silence. That evening I sat in my office again, but this time with an odd sense of peace. For 15 years I had given endlessly my money, my time, my silence, and they had taken it all without a second thought. But now for the first time they were forced to recognize the cost. Here's where I want to pause and ask you something. Have you ever had to set terms with people who took you for granted? Have you ever been forced to put boundaries in writing because words weren't enough? Think about it and tell me below. Because boundaries aren't cruelty, they're survival. 2 days later, just as the deadline hit, an envelope arrived at my office. Inside was a check for $75,000. Alongside it were 4 letters each in different handwriting. Frank's was contrite, filled with sincerity. Sarah's was formal, careful. Scott's was begrudging, dripping with resentment. His parents' letter was diplomatic, stiff, more concerned with appearances than remorse. It didn't matter. They had complied, and compliance in this case was victory. The wedding would happen, but on my terms. And soon the world would see exactly what happens when the invisible woman steps into the spotlight. 4 weeks later, I stood at Canyon View Lodge, one of Morrison Hospitality's smaller but most breathtaking properties overlooking the desert foothills. The panoramic mountains stretched endlessly, painted gold and crimson by the late afternoon sun. This was not the grand, ostentatious affair Frank and Sarah had first imagined. This was my design, elegant, stripped of excess, intimate. 40 guests instead of 60, wildflowers in simple vases, a ceremony built on authenticity instead of performance. I moved through the hall with a calm authority, checking every detail. The vendors now worked with a reverence I had never seen before. Each one knew they weren't just serving a wedding, they were working directly for Morrison Hospitality. Contracts bore my signature. Their livelihoods depended on my goodwill, and so they delivered perfection down to the last polished glass and plated entree. Frank was calmer, too. His shoulders, once weighed down with financial strain, now carried relief. With fewer guests, he could breathe. He moved among them with genuine warmth instead of forced small talk. Sarah, in a simpler gown than her first choice, radiated a quiet beauty that felt more real than the showy image she once wanted. During dinner, Frank rose to speak. His voice carried across the smaller gathering with conviction. Before Sarah and I exchange vows, I need to acknowledge something. This celebration exists today because of Emily. Not just because of her generosity, but because of her willingness to hold us accountable when we failed her. We turned our backs on her. She rebuilt what we destroyed. That is strength. That is integrity. Applause erupted loud and sustained. Not the polite claps of obligation, but genuine recognition. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Sarah then stood beside him, her voice trembling with sincerity. Emily, I want to apologize. Our family betrayed your kindness. We accepted your money while excluding you. That was a moral failure, and I will never forget it. Thank you for teaching us what dignity looks like. Her words, public and undeniable, gave me something private apologies never could vindication. But Scott. He remained silent, sitting stiffly at the corner table. His usual bravado had withered. He looked like a man who knew the world had shifted and left him behind. The husband who once dismissed me as arrogant now sat subdued in a celebration that bore my fingerprints on every detail. I sipped my wine, feeling the weight of years of silence finally lifting. This wedding wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting my place in the story, no longer invisible, no longer erased. Let me pause here because this is where I want to speak directly to you. How many times have you sacrificed in silence, hoping for recognition that never came? How many times have you watched others take credit while you disappeared into the background? Subscribe now, because this community is where we tell the truth that invisibility is not destiny. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting the sky in colors, no decorator could replicate. Frank and Sarah shared their first dance. The intimacy of the evening made it beautiful in ways their original extravagance never could. Guests whispered about how meaningful it all felt. And every whisper reminded me I had not just saved a wedding. I had redefined it. By the time the cake was cut, I realized something profound. This wasn't just their wedding anymore. It was my declaration of presence, my reminder to every single person in that room and to myself that I would never again be erased. And though forgiveness lingered in the air, one truth was sharper than ever: they would never underestimate me again. The evening wound down, but the atmosphere remained charged. Guests lingered in small groups, whispering about what had just unfolded. I stood at the edge of the terrace, the desert wind brushing against my face, and allowed myself a moment of reflection. 15 years of quiet patience, 15 years of providing for others while remaining unseen, had culminated in this night. And for the first time, I felt fully acknowledged, not for my wealth, not for my business acumen, but for the person I had always been. Scott approached cautious, his usual arrogance replaced with an almost visible tension. "Emily, can we talk?" His voice was measured, attempting calm, but I heard the tremor beneath. After everything he had failed to recognize, that words alone could not undo the lessons learned tonight. I turned to face him, cool and deliberate. "There's nothing to talk about, Scott. You had 15 years to understand my value, and yet you chose to see me as a resource, not a partner. This isn't about reconciliation, it's about clarity." His eyes darted toward Frank and Sarah, who were sharing a quiet moment near the dance floor. He realized, as I knew he would, that his influence over them was now secondary to the reality of my control over every element of the celebration. Every catering table, every hotel room, every booking my empire had woven itself into their dreams. Yet it had taken their betrayal to reveal just how much power I wielded. Teresa and Scott's parents approached hesitantly, their voices filled with the kind of diplomatic concern that always comes too late. Emily, we understand that. We want to make amends. Can we discuss what happened? I studied them, noting their posture, their forced smiles, the calculated politeness. They had spent weeks manipulating the narrative, gaslighting me into believing I had to accept their version of events. Now the tables had turned. Their excuses held no weight against the reality of my influence, their words meaningless in the face of my authority. This isn't about discussion, I replied evenly. It's about acknowledgement. You've been given everything: clarity, transparency, and the consequences of your actions. That is the resolution you get. Any further conversation must begin with acceptance of that truth. I watched the wind ripple across the desert as a metaphor for the movement of power in my life. Quiet, unseen, unstoppable. For years I had been the calm, accommodating wife, the silent partner, the generous supporter. But the events of this wedding had awakened something deeper, something unyielding, the refusal to be erased, the insistence on respect, the demand for recognition of my true place in the world. And the realization settled in: fully respect and dignity are not given. They are claimed. They are enforced through action, through consequence, and through the courage to reclaim what has always belonged to you. Frank and Sarah approached me, both humbled and sincere. Emily, we can never repay you, Frank said. Your generosity saved our wedding and reminded us of the responsibilities that come with power and privilege. Thank you for showing us what integrity looks like. Sarah's voice wavered with emotion. You taught us more than we could ever have learned from any guidebook. I hope we can live up to the example you set tonight. I smiled faintly inwardly, recognizing the irony. The family who had tried to erase me had inadvertently amplified my reputation. My power had been hidden, underestimated, and yet now it was undeniable. The whispers among the guests, the respect in the eyes of every vendor, and the sincerity in Frank and Sarah's words cemented a truth I had known but rarely exercised. Influence is only meaningful when it is recognized, and respect is only real when it is earned. For the first time in years, I felt free, not just in my business, but in my life. Free from the subtle diminishment, free from the manipulations, and free from the weight of being invisible to the people who should have cherished me most. I had reclaimed my narrative, and in doing so, I had taught everyone involved a lesson they would not soon forget. The morning after the wedding, Scott was nowhere to be seen. His absence was telling. He had spent the previous night rehearsing apologies, planning excuses, trying to figure out how to reclaim some semblance of control. But control had shifted irreversibly. He had gambled on my compliance, my silence, my invisibility, and he had lost. For the first time, he understood the depth of his miscalculation. I stood at the garage loading my Range Rover with the few personal items that truly mattered. Photographs, sentimental keepsakes, documents, and practical necessities. Everything else was merely shared property, inconsequential to the woman who had built an empire from nothing. 15 years of marriage reduced to what could fit in a single vehicle was a stark visualization of the emotional detachment I had cultivated over years of giving silently while being undervalued. Scott appeared, his expression a mixture of desperation and disbelief. Tessa, please don't make any irreversible decisions. We can fix this. Marriage counseling, whatever you need. We can rebuild trust if you just give us a chance. I didn't turn back. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and I felt the finality in the decision. No, Scott, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice, a calculated decision to humiliate me while keeping access to my resources. That is who you are. As I started the engine, The weight of 15 years of accommodation and minimization lifted. The driveway stretched ahead, illuminated by the morning sun. Each foot forward was a reclamation of autonomy, a reaffirmation of self-worth, a declaration that generosity does not equate to invisibility. The Phoenix skyline, vast and golden in the morning light, seemed to cheer on every mile I moved away from the past, toward a future defined on my terms. 3 months later, Morrison Hospitality had moved into a new headquarters in Scottsdale. The building's glass facade reflected the desert sun, housing the expanded operations that had followed the family crisis. My reputation, previously confined to whispered respect among industry insiders, had evolved into recognition of an industry powerhouse, a woman whose influence could shift markets, redirect contracts, and dictate terms where others assumed dominion. The story of the wedding spread, each retelling emphasizing a different facet of the events, but all agreed on the central truth: Emily Morrison had been underestimated for years, and she had proven her unmatched capability under pressure. Industry competitors, once dismissive, now sought partnerships. Vendors who had performed routine services approached me with newfound respect, knowing that their compliance now carried weight. Opportunities came not merely because of my previous success, but because I had demonstrated decisiveness, control, and strategic foresight when confronted with betrayal. The family drama intended to undermine me had instead elevated my professional standing beyond anything marketing campaigns could have achieved. Frank and Sarah's marriage also evolved in response. They established an annual scholarship fund for hospitality management students, funded from a portion of Frank's architectural firm's profits, inspired by my example of combining success with responsibility. Their continued moral development contrasted sharply with Scott's self-serving attempts at reconciliation, revealing the fundamental difference between those who learn from consequences and those who simply seek to recover privileges lost. In my Scottsdale home, surrounded by the empire I had built and the life I had reclaimed, I found a quiet peace. The silence once feared became a sanctuary. Here my worth was measured not by those who once betrayed me, but by the integrity of my decisions, the scope of my influence, and the clarity of my autonomy. Every home, every office, every relationship reflected the standards I had set, no longer dictated by the expectations or dismissals of others. Evenings were spent reviewing Morrison Hospitality's expanding portfolio, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of knowing that respect and recognition now followed me wherever I moved. Industry colleagues called to discuss partnerships, acquisitions, and collaborations opportunities that were previously inaccessible now, a testament to the power of decisive action and the consequences of betrayal. And in the personal sphere, I thrived. No longer constrained by the dynamics of a family who mistook generosity for weakness, I cultivated relationships with those who valued me genuinely, who recognized both my power and my humanity. 15 years of being undervalued were replaced by a life of respect, autonomy, and fulfillment, an existence defined not by the approval of others, but by the standards I had always known I deserved. This ultimately was the lesson I carried forward. Power and respect are earned not through quiet compliance, but through the courage to reclaim your worth when others attempt to diminish it. And when you do, the world finally adjusts to the magnitude of your presence. As the sun set over Scottsdale, painting the glass facade of Morrison Hospitality in hues of gold and amber, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The storm of betrayal, manipulation, and erasure that had dominated the past months was now behind me. The weddings, the calls, the endless family confrontations, they were all lessons carved into the fabric of my life, shaping a resilience I had only glimpsed before. I walked through the halls of my new headquarters, each office, each boardroom, each carefully curated space a testament to my vision and perseverance. The empire I had built was no longer an abstract concept. It was tangible, undeniable, and respected. Vendors, colleagues, and clients now treated me with a recognition that had eluded me within my own family for 15 years. Respect, I realized, was never about forcing it from others. It was about demonstrating that your boundaries, your value, and your decisions carried weight and consequence. In my personal life, I discovered a newfound clarity. Freed from relationships that had conditioned me to accommodate invisibility, I nurtured connections that honored my presence. Friends, mentors, and partners were no longer peripheral voices. They were genuine allies who recognized both my humanity and my power. Every conversation, every decision, every quiet evening in my Scottsdale home reaffirmed that autonomy and self-respect were not privileges, they were necessities. The story of Frank and Sarah's wedding, once a symbol of betrayal, had transformed into a narrative of empowerment and justice. It reminded me, and perhaps anyone who has been undervalued, that patience and resilience do not equate to submission. True strength is exercised quietly until the moment demands clarity, decisiveness, and unwavering assertion of one's worth. Looking out over the desert horizon, I allowed myself a small smile. The quiet woman who had been dismissed, underestimated, and erased had emerged fully into her power. She had reclaimed her life, her empire, and her dignity. And in doing so, she had created a future defined not by the expectations of others, but by the reality of her own extraordinary capability. This was more than closure, it was freedom.